Welcome back to another episode of Fantastic Descriptions, a YouTube channel that explores the fine art of narrative storytelling as it takes place in your role-playing game. Or more specifically, what can we do as dungeon masters and game masters to make our descriptions more compelling, the world more immersive, the villains more villainous, and the actions more heroic and epic, and going beyond just simply the use of, well, miniatures and terrain and music and other additional props and tools that we have available. What can we do in just language to make the world come more alive? Okay, so if you're interested in villains, that's what we're talking about today. Last time we talked a lot about describing people, and we ran through kind of an order or a strategy for explaining, for thinking about how to present a person to the party. For the first time and first encounter that they've had with this character. When describing villains, especially entrances, you're doing very much the same thing. You're just tailoring it for a very specific purpose. So once again, before you even have the party see the villain, most likely there is something that they will sense. And that sense might be in terms of a sense of dread, a sense of evil, a sense of cold, or maybe it's heat, or maybe it's something else, a malevolence. It's almost tangible in some way. But there's an idea that a villain might have an aura about them, and that even as they draw closer and closer, it will intensify. And so that sense of dread that the party has in the encounter can be built upon simply by alluding to that fact, that there is a growing sense, something that is accelerating or accumulating over time the closer this figure draws to them, or once they see it, or they get close to it. Once you are in the mode of describing what's actually happening and you have the figure before them, then it's the same sort of run through of considerations. You're going to pay attention to the size and the posture of the villain. Its action or movement or performance. What is it actually doing in this moment? Does it possess any threatening features? And that might be as simple as, like, you see that it has prominent horns, or that there is maybe along its surface of its skin play some eldritch energy that flares and crackles, or there might be fire that shoots out, or its eyes glow in some ominous way. But all these things are signals that there is something ominous, malevolent, deadly about this figure. And then you might also note unusual accessories. Does the villain come accompanied by, some sort of a lackey, or do they bring with them some terrible weapon or object that the party knows to read as being potentially dangerous? Or is it there's some sort of a weird disconnect? Maybe they come clutching something that we wouldn't associate with the villain, but has significance to the party. They see that the villain arrives, dragging behind him an NPC, or at least half of the corpse of the NPC. And the party automatically knows to read that they really don't like this guy, or this girl, this female, this creature, whatever it is. One of the other things to consider then, in addition to thinking about the aura and thinking about the physical presence, the initial impression that one gets when you encounter them, is think about what is it that you want to describe that helps the characters recognize a connection to the villain. When Freud talks about the uncanny, about the fact that there are certain things that we encounter that deeply trouble us and we can't put a finger on exactly why, that word uncanny in German is unhomely, that it's as if it's familiar and at the same time wrong. And so what it is then is really, when we see that figure of the villain, is there something about them that feels slightly familiar and yet at the same time not quite right. So classic examples, if you remember in Dragonlance, There's an anti-paladin, one who's a fallen paladin. He has the outward signs as if he once were a great paladin, but something has become horribly twisted and corrupted. And so the familiarity of the outward signs, coupled with the fact that they're blackened and they are twisted and contorted in some way, are signals to us that there's something deeply wrong about this particular figure. So those are like marks that you can use. Likewise, you can have some element that feels like the example I gave earlier. If the villain comes dragging or wearing something that is familiar to the party as belonging to someone that they have a connection with already, then that will feel even more intense. We will have a connection to that villain because we recognize something about them that is like us, or that they have a connection to us because they've purposefully or accidentally they've come into our world as well. So think about that. So what is the personal connection that they can find in the villain? Is the villain purposefully executing that particular connection? Or is it just something where they see something that they can almost identify, and then at the same time is clearly not good or not right or not aligned with what they're doing? Okay, so that kind of falls in the category of unexpected similarities. Are there moments like when they look at that villain, is there something that is so starkly different? And again, I said not necessarily a disability, but just something that, the eyes glow with flame, right? Or that there's something, there's some strange aura about them, which we've talked about earlier. But there are like things that could be markedly different about them. Maybe they're 7 feet tall. Maybe it's the size aspect that really jumps out. Maybe they don't speak at all, and it is just this haunting whisper they hear in their minds that is deeply disturbing. So the relation to the PCs needs to be, this key is really important in terms of ensuring that the players feel there's something that they have at stake in here, that the villain has done something to cross over into their world, and therefore they need to do something about it. And the final thing to consider is dialogue. I will say this is kind of a mixed bag, right? Some villains are very talkative, and classic James Bond, you have villains that launch off on these long discussions about their great plans to destroy the world, meanwhile providing the players plenty of time to escape or to thwart those plans, or to buy themselves a little bit more time to come up with a new strategy. So I think what's important here when we think about dialogue is that it doesn't have to be lengthy. In fact, the smarter your villain, the less likely they are to launch into one of these long diatribes. And instead of monologuing, they're going to be very pragmatic and very focused, and perhaps even lie. Heaven forbid the villain lies. And so I think it's important to think about like what type of dialogue can be used by a villain. If the villain wants to let out that they are consciously villainous, or is there something that the villain says that creates some anxiety with the party as to whether or not they truly are villainous? Maybe in their mind what they're doing is for the better good, and for the greater good. Maybe there's some way in which they've rationalized everything away, and perhaps this creates a moment for the players to consider whether or not their characters really are opposed to whatever the villain is setting out to do. Dialogue can also refer to whatever speech markers you want to use to make this villain sound particularly sinister, or evil, or if there are phrases they want to use. This goes partly to your own level of voice acting and comfort and doing different type of voices. Once again, be careful. You'll find that it may be easy to code your villains using specific accents, and that may not always be appropriate, and may often be offensive depending on who's at your table. But at the very least, we've reached a point where we should be thinking about, like, why have we defaulted in certain ways? So please avoid being the merciless. Please avoid coding all your goblins as Mexican street gangsters, or just others are really questionable. One, I worry about them being too cliche, and there's a way in which your villain just becomes comical the more you default to old tropes that have been done to death. Now, that being said, what can we do with voice? What can we do with dialogue that would make someone more villainous? I think it just boils down to speech mannerisms, and as well as you could take advantage of certain key phrases or ways of expressing oneself that might make someone seem more villainous. So that way, I would reflect. I'd think about what their attribute scores are telling you about how they might present themselves, what their character background, whatever you've chosen to represent this villain with, in terms of where they're coming from. That might also influence how they present themselves verbally. So, for instance, is this a villain who is an academic or a scholar or a sage or a wizard, someone who's very studied, their intelligence is exceptionally high, in which case perhaps they lean more towards a rational and a more erudite sort of discussion of things, that they are insistent on vocabulary, insistent on calculation, and insistent on sort of strict and logical, rational interpretation of things. There's only one way that this could go. You should really surrender, because there's nothing else here that makes sense. So it may, at a certain point, it may be inconceivable, to borrow a classic from Prince's Bride, to imagine anything other than this particular path that the villain has taken. And they may not even be able to comprehend why the heroes would want to do something differently. So that's one path to consider. If your villain is particularly wise, then maybe there's some instinct or intuition that they read deeply into the hearts and the minds of the characters, and play off of their emotions, manipulate them in particular ways, and that can be really compelling. And so you see mannered in their speech sort of that sense of almost as if they were trying to be a friend, trying to be a counselor, guide them towards something. And you can see that type of path. If they are particularly, if those mental stats are lower, perhaps it's something else that's going on. If they're high in charisma, they may simply be persuasive in other ways. They may be charming. They may be extremely diplomatic. But I would look at the stats as sort of an inspiration for how to role play, and what kind of dialogue would emerge out of that. If they pride themselves on their physical strength or their endurance, then that's going to creep into the way that they talk. They're going to use that as sort of the way that they frame things. So villains who pride themselves on strength will evaluate others based on their strength or their weakness, and find other types of skills or attributes less compelling and less worthy of survival. Those who are so I think those are the types of things I would pay attention to, and take advantage of sort of attribute scores as inspiration for which way the dialogue is going to go. Those who have weaknesses in this particular area may just default to relying on other stats as sort of their guidance to navigate through. So they may resent or disagree with or take umbrage against those who are significantly better than them in these other areas. And that may be sort of where they're coming from in terms of their anger and in terms of their willfulness for why they're trying to do this. And so I think like looking at these things can be helpful to inspire you in terms of what direction a dialogue might go for a villain. And that being said, no one really wants a villain that monologues all the time. In fact, a lot of times, I've played in wonderful campaigns with a fantastic DM who frequently, he had memorized many of the Shakespearean sort of plays, especially their monologues for a number of the key villains in them. And then he would just on the fly adapt and work them into these moments. And while on one hand, it was quite compelling to see a well-performed Shakespearean monologue, these villain monologues invariably cut into our playtime. And so we would be quick to find ways to circumvent or interrupt these things. And there's something almost comical about that. So if that's your style of game where you like to have sort of a comical villain or this moment in which the villain monologues instead of like being pragmatic, then by all means, if that's your play style, that's what you do. But if you want something realistic, go back over some of those lists of like overlord rules, evil overlord rules, and you'll see there's like so many different things that a pragmatic, intelligent, and highly successful evil overlord would adopt. And one of them is simply not to monologue. Why give away your plans? Why not just plant more confusion? Why not introduce more lies and deception and insecurity into the players' minds rather than divulge, these great secrets? And so, or why waste time and simply start executing people? And so I think it's important that when we're role-playing villains that we pay attention to what style of game we're in, but also like how realistic we want those villains to act, and how that's going to impact both the actions that they take and also the ways in which they communicate with the players, with the characters in the game. Okay, so that's basically where we're going to leave it for this particular episode. We're going to pick up next time and go into a little bit more detail. There are like six different types of villains and how we might represent them. We'll talk a little bit about that. Another episode on villains, we'll go into thinking about like how description of a villain is simultaneously a manifestation of how the villain views themselves, as also and also sort of a revelation of how they want to be seen by others. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that and a little bit of how the psychology works on that. So next time we're talking more about villains, in terms of 6 different types of villains and how you might present them. And then after that, we'll kind of return to a more psychological approach and think about like, what is it about the way that a villain presents themselves that communicates who they think they are, as well as who they want other people to view them as. Okay? And so if you've enjoyed this particular video and enjoyed this series, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. Check back often. I'm trying to produce more of these videos. I've got these other ones in the pipeline, so these are coming, and we'll be a little bit more speedy in doing them. But I'm also always open to suggestions for other topics and things to explore. And in general, I hope you're doing well, and we'll be back again soon. Bye.